She made one mistake at the Yun family reunion, and it cost her 11 years. 11 years of Sunday dinners she planned, holidays she arranged, and a family she had loved before she understood she would never be accepted by them. And then at the last reunion she would ever attend, they gave her a folding chair, not a seat at the table, a folding chair, in the garage. While the rain came down outside and the family gathered in the warm dining room beyond a closed door, her name was Soo-ah, and the man who found her sitting in that garage was not a cousin. He was not a neighbor. He was the man the Yun family had spent 11 years pretending did not exist. And when he walked her out of that garage and into the rest of her life, every person sitting at that dining room table would eventually understand exactly what they had discarded. The question the Yun family never thought to ask was this: who had been holding them up all along? By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The reunion was held at the Yun family compound outside a mid-sized city, the kind of property that announced itself before you arrived. A long gravel driveway lined with imported ornamental maples, a main house with 16 rooms, a second guest house that slept 8, and a garage large enough for 4 vehicles, and apparently 1 folding chair. The Yoon family had made their money in pharmaceutical distribution over 2 generations, and they wore that money the way certain people wear a coat they know is too expensive for the occasion, deliberately, so that you would notice. Sua had been part of this world for 11 years, ever since she married Ji-won-yoon, the second of 3 sons, the quiet one, the one his mother referred to in conversation as the middle situation. She had come into the family at 26, a structural engineer with a master's degree and a precise, methodical way of looking at problems that the Yoon family mistook initially for deference. She was not deferential, she was thorough. There is a difference, and it would take the Yan family 11 years to understand it, by which time understanding would cost them considerably. She had, in those 11 years, rebuilt the foundations of more things in the Yoon world than anyone at that dining room table comprehended. When Ji-won's older brother, Dae-won, had overextended the distribution network into 3 new provinces and the contracts had started hemorrhaging, it was Sua who sat with the numbers for 47 consecutive evenings, restructured the liability architecture, and quietly renegotiated 2 of the 3 agreements before anyone at the company's senior level knew there was a problem. She had told no one she had done this. She had told Jae-won, who thanked her, said it was impressive, and then mentioned it once to his father as something that had worked itself out. The family patriarch, Yoon Ba-young-chul, a man of 71 who had spent his life believing that problems resolved themselves through his authority rather than through anyone's labor, had nodded and moved on. Sua had filed the memory. She had many such files. She had built the family's charitable foundation from a tax instrument into a functioning institution. She had managed Byung-chul's medical documentation across 3 hospital systems when his heart required stenting, coordinating with 4 physicians across 2 cities so that his records traveled correctly and his follow-up regimen was precise. She had, over 11 years, served as the infrastructure the Yoon family ran on without ever calling it that. What they called it was helping out. What they called her was Ji-won's wife. Sometimes, when she was not in the room, they called her the engineer, and they did not mean it as a compliment. She understood all of this. She had understood it for a long time. She had stayed not from blindness, but from love. She had loved Jae-won with a patient, attentive love that she now understood he had received as a kind of ambient condition, something like good weather, present and unremarkable, and expected to continue. She had stayed for her daughter Min-seo, who was 9 years old at the time of the last reunion, and who deserved, Soo-ah believed, the continuity of the family she had grown up inside, even a flawed one. She had stayed because leaving had costs, and she had been, until recently, willing to pay them. What she had not been willing to pay was this. The morning of the reunion, Chae-won's mother, Yun Jong-hee, a woman of 64 who deployed graciousness the way a military officer deploys a particular unit, precise and tactical, and entirely in the service of a larger objective, had pulled Soo-ah aside in the kitchen. She had told her in a tone of elaborate kindness that this year the seating in the main dining room would be family only, that Soo-ah would understand that there was space set up in the garage that would be quite comfortable, that there would be a space heater. Soo-ah had stood in that kitchen for a moment. She had looked at Jeong-hee. She had said, "I understand." She did understand. She understood with perfect, terrible clarity. She carried the folding chair herself. She set it up between a riding lawnmower and a shelf of motor oil in the garage. She sat down. The rain came through the gap under the garage door and drew a thin gray line across the concrete floor, and the sound of the family's laughter moved through the closed interior door in waves, and Soo-ah sat with her hands folded and looked at the middle distance and thought, with the same methodical precision she brought to structural problems, about what she was going to do next. She had been sitting there for 12 minutes when the side door opened. The man who came through it was tall, wearing a dark jacket that was completely wrong for a family reunion, not in a shabby way, but in the way of someone who did not adjust his clothing for the occasion because the occasion was adjusting to him. He was 53 years old. He looked it without apology. He had the kind of stillness that some people mistake for slowness. He stood in the doorway and looked at the folding chair, and then at Soo-ah, and then at the space heater in the corner, which was not, in fact, making the garage warm, and he said 4 words. "This is where they put you." It was not a question. It was an inventory. His name was Han Kyung-jin. He was the older half-brother of Yoon Byung-chul. He was the son Byung-chul's father had produced with a woman the family had never named. The branch of the family that had been deliberately omitted from every official account of Yoon prosperity. He had arrived at this reunion without an invitation, and in a car that 2 of the Yoon cousins would later describe in tones of reluctant admiration as the kind of vehicle that made your own car feel embarrassed. He had come because Byung-chul was 71 and had a stented heart, and because Han Kyung-jin had decided, without asking anyone's permission, that certain things ought to be said before they could no longer be said. What he was in the world, the Yun family officially refused to acknowledge, was the operational head of a network, so old and layered it had no clean name in any language. The people who dealt with him called the network the Han arrangement. The people who feared it called it other things. He had run it for 22 years with the same kind of quiet infrastructure logic that Soo-ah had brought to the Yun family's problems, and he had recognized her precision the moment he read about her, which he had done before he ever came to the reunion, because Han Kyung-jin did not arrive anywhere without reading first. He pulled a second chair from the wall, a proper chair, wooden, that had been stored there for no clear reason, and he set it opposite hers and he sat down. The riding lawnmower stood between them and the closed door like a chaperone. The rain continued. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had decided in advance to be honest, and he said, "I read the restructuring you did for the distribution contracts 4 years ago. Daewon showed it to me without knowing what it was. He thought he was showing me a consultant's report." Soo-ah said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He found a consultant." "He found you," Kyung-jin said. "And then he found a consultant to stand in front of the work." She looked at the thin gray line of rain on the concrete floor. "He needed a name on it that the suppliers would recognize," she said. "He needed a name," Kyung-jin said, "so that no one would have to acknowledge that the family's recovery was authored by the woman they put in the garage. The sentence landed in the cold air between them and stayed there. This was the moment, not a dramatic moment, not loud. Just the specific weight of being seen, accurately and without softness, by someone who had no reason to flatter her. She had been seen precisely once in 11 years, and it had taken a man who was not supposed to be at the reunion at all. She said, "Why are you here to speak to my brother?" He said, "Before I can't." He paused. "And apparently to sit in a garage with the most competent person on the property? You don't know that." "I read everything I could find," he said. "I know what the foundation's asset base was before you and what it is now. I know that the medical coordination during Byung-chul's cardiac event in the winter 3 years ago was not done by the hospital liaison. I know the liaison took the credit. I know these things because the people who actually did the work know who did the work, and they talk sometimes to people who pay attention." He said the word attention the way some people say a word they have been saving. Sua looked at him directly for the first time. She was 37 years old, and she had spent 11 years in a family that had looked through her, and she was looking now at a man who had looked at her carefully enough to come to a garage in the rain for a reason that was not entirely about his brother. "What do you want?" she said. "Right now," he said. "I want to know if you've decided anything." She thought about the kitchen that morning, about Jong-hee's tactical kindness, about the 12 minutes before the side door opened. "I decided something," she said. "I thought so," he said. "You had the look of someone who has finished calculating." She almost smiled. Almost. "What do you need from me for your conversation with Byung-chul?" He studied her. "Why would you help me?" "Because," she said, "the man who runs this family's medical record has 3 errors in his cardiac file that no one has corrected, and I've been waiting for someone with standing to bring them to Byung-chul's attention without it becoming a political problem inside the family. You have standing, I have the documentation. The silence after that was not empty. It was full of a particular kind of recalibration, the kind that happens when two careful people realize they have been, without planning it, useful to each other." He said, "Where is the documentation?" "In my car," she said. "I carry it to every family event, in case." "In case," he repeated. "I am a structural engineer," she said. "I do not arrive at a load-bearing situation without knowing where the weak points are." That was the beginning. What followed did not happen quickly. This is the part that matters most, and the part that is most often misunderstood in the telling. It did not happen quickly because neither of them was interested in speed. Speed is for people who are afraid of what stillness will reveal. These two people were not afraid of stillness. They had both spent years in it. Kyung-jin had his conversation with Byung-chul that afternoon, and it was not easy, and it was not resolved in a single conversation. But the medical errors were corrected within a week, and the cardiologist's subsequent review discovered a dosage interaction that had been subtly affecting Byung-chul's cognition for 14 months. The correction of that interaction would, over the following 3 months, produce a clarity in the family patriarch that several members of the family found inconvenient, because a clear-eyed Byung-chul asked questions that a medicated Byung-chul had not been asking. He asked them of day one. He asked them of the family's financial officer. He asked them of his wife. He did not ask them of Sua, because by then Sua was no longer available to be asked. She had left the reunion that evening with her daughter Min-seo in her own car, carrying one bag, and she had driven 4 hours to a city that was not her city, to a building that had nothing to do with the Yun family, and she had begun what she had decided in the garage. Days later, the papers were filed. Not divorce papers yet, a formal financial disclosure filing, through a compliance attorney whose services Han Kyung-jin had, with extreme discretion, arranged. The filing was not aggressive. It was methodical. It itemized 11 years of labor, 11 years of organizational contribution, 11 years of intellectual work, credited to other names. It was not a settlement demand. It was a statement of record. It was Sua doing what Sua did, building the foundation before the structure goes up. Jae-won called her 14 times in the first 3 days. She answered once. She said, "I need 60 days." He said, "For what?" She said, to decide what I want to build. Then, and to find out what you actually want, not what your family wants, you. He was quiet for a long time. She said, that's what I thought. She hung up. Weeks later, the Yun family began to feel the withdrawal. Not her physical absence, though they felt that too, in the way that a building feels it when a load-bearing wall is removed and the floors begin to creak and nothing is visibly wrong yet, but everything is leaning slightly in a new and troubling direction. What they felt was the withdrawal of her network, because Sua, over 11 years, had built relationships with every significant partner, supplier, and institutional contact the Yun distribution business operated through, and she had built them the way she built everything, carefully, with attention, in her own name and with her own credibility. And those relationships were not transferable. They belonged to her. She had not planned this as a weapon. She had built them because she paid attention and she showed up and she remembered the details that mattered to people, the names of their children and the specifics of the difficulties they had navigated and the commitments she had made to them that she had always kept. The weapon was incidental. It was the natural consequence of spending 11 years being the only person in the room who was actually paying attention. 3 of the family's 7 major supply chain partners reached out to Sua directly within the first 6 weeks of her departure. They were not calling to be disloyal to the Yun family. They were calling because they trusted her, and because in certain cases the ongoing management of their agreements had her name on it in ways the Yun family had not fully examined. She was careful with those calls. She did not leverage them. She simply confirmed that she was available to speak and that she would be in touch when she had clarity about her own next steps. She had clarity faster than she had expected. Han Kyung-jin visited her twice in those early weeks. Both visits were brief. Both were conducted with a formality that was not cold, but that was deliberate. The formality of 2 people who respect the weight of what they are not yet saying. He brought Min Seo a book the second time, a large illustrated atlas of the world's bridges, and Min Seo, who had inherited her mother's precise attention to structure, spent 3 hours with it that evening and asked 7 questions about cantilever physics that Sua answered, and that would have pleased any engineer to hear from a 9-year-old. He said on the second visit, "I have a problem with the building," she said. "What kind?" "I bought a building 18 months ago, a mixed-use structure in the Port District, 12 floors. The renovation has stalled because 3 separate contractors have identified a foundation issue and 3 separate contractors have given me 3 contradictory analyses." She said, "Send me the reports." She read all 3 reports in one evening. She wrote a 14-page analysis the following morning, identifying the precise nature of the disagreement, which was not actually about the foundation, but about an incorrect load assumption in the original survey that all 3 contractors had inherited without questioning. She sent it to him with a note that said, "The problem is not in the ground, it's in the assumption everyone started with." He read it. He called her. He said, "How long would it take you to fix the assumption?" She said, "Properly. 8 months of supervised remediation," he said, "and if I hired you to oversee it." She said, "Then I would need a contract in my name with my firm name on it, in full site authority, no intermediary, no one to stand in front of the work." There was a pause. He said, "Obviously, that was the second beginning." She registered her firm in the same week, Park Sua Structural Consultancy. 4 words, her name first. She had spent 11 years not putting her name first, and the registration felt like setting a bone correctly. The divorce proceedings moved in parallel, methodically, without escalation. Jae-won, when he finally sat with a financial disclosure attorney who was not his family's attorney, understood for the first time the shape of what he had participated in. He was not a cruel man. He was an inattentive one. There is a difference, and it matters, but it does not excuse. He told his attorney that he thought things had been fine. His attorney, a woman of 45 who had seen this particular sentence in 17 years of practice, said, "Fine for whom?" He did not have an answer. The settlement was not contentious. It was precise. Sue, as attorney, working from the financial disclosure filing she had built herself, documented 11 years of contribution with the same rigor she would have brought to a structural assessment. The settlement included a valuation of the foundation work, the contract restructuring, the medical coordination, the network relationships. It was a number that made the Yun family's attorney go quiet for a full minute during the first review session, not because it was inflated, but because it was defensible, and both sides knew it. Byung-chul, clearer now in his cognition after the medication correction, reviewed the settlement figure and said nothing for a long time. Then he said to his son Dae-won, who was present, "We paid her in folding chairs." He did not say it with drama. He said it the way a man says something that is simply irreducibly true. Months later, Sua's firm was contracted for the Port District building. She had a team of 6 by then, 3 structural engineers and 2 project managers and an administrative director who had worked with her briefly years earlier and who had, upon hearing that she was starting her own practice, called her before the ink on the registration was dry. The building's remediation went on schedule. The original load assumption was corrected. The 12 floors were sound. Han Kyung-jin came to the site on a Tuesday morning in the 8th month, wearing the same kind of jacket he had worn at the reunion, the kind that did not adjust to the occasion. He stood with her on the 4th floor, which was open to the sky on one side, scaffolding framing a rectangle of cold blue morning air, and he watched her explain a stress distribution diagram to 2 of her junior engineers with the patience and precision of someone who found this particular kind of explanation genuinely interesting rather than obligatory. He said nothing while she worked. He had learned in these months that the best thing he could do for someone who operated the way she operated was to leave space around them and pay attention. When her engineers moved on, she turned and found him standing exactly where she had left him. She said, "The foundation holds," he said. "I know. I mean the building." "I know what you mean," he said. And then, "I also mean both." She looked at him with the same directness she had offered in the garage 10 months ago. She had not been careless with this. She had been watching the way he handled the distance she set between them. He had not pushed through it. He had not pretended it wasn't there. He had simply continued showing up with the same precision and the same unhurried attention, and she had filed every instance of it. She had many files. She said, "Minseo has questions about the Akashi Bridge." He said, "I have answers." She said, "She'll want documentation." He said, "I'll source it." It was not a declaration. It was an agreement between 2 people who spoke in structures rather than in performances, and it was exactly as real as a foundation drawn true and set at the correct depth, which is to say, it was real in the way that the things that hold weight are always real, quietly and without ceremony, doing the work. What became of the Yun family in the months that followed was not catastrophic. It was simply accurate. The distribution network contracted by 31% in the first year after Sua's departure, not because of any action she took, but because the relationships that had held the network together had been held by her, and held by her alone. And no one had understood that while it was happening, Dae-won hired 3 consultants to fill the gap and found that the gap was not the kind that consultants fill. The kind of gap it was could only be filled by someone who had been paying the specific kind of attention Sue had been paying over years to the specific people involved, and that kind of attention is not a service you can retain on a monthly fee structure. It is a practice. It takes time. It requires you to decide, before you start, that the people in front of you matter. The foundation, the charitable institution Sua had built over 11 years, continued operating well after her departure because she had built it to operate without her. That was the tell if anyone had been watching for it. An institution built by someone who was protecting their position is built to need them. An institution built by someone who cared about the institution's purpose is built to outlast them. Byung-chul, in one of his newly lucid months, sat down with the foundation's board minutes. and read 11 years of them in 2 evenings. He called Jae-won afterward. He said one sentence. Jae-won did not share the sentence, but those who were present at the call reported that he sat with the phone for a long time after his father hung up, and that he looked like a man who was understanding something he could not unknow. Soo-ah heard this secondhand from the foundation's administrative director, who was still, by affection and habit, in touch with her. She did not respond to the information with satisfaction. Exactly. She responded with the specific quality of recognition that comes when an accurate assessment is confirmed. She had not needed it confirmed, but she was human enough to feel, briefly, the weight of being right about a thing you had wished you were wrong about. She was also, by this point, building something she had not built before, something that did not have the shape of support or infrastructure or the filling in of other people's gaps. The firm was hers, the site was hers. The team she had assembled called her by her name, not her husband's name, not her title, relative to someone else. The Port District building rose floor by floor through the winter and into the spring of Minseo's 10th year. And there was an evening in March when Soo-ah stood in the open 4th floor space as the scaffolding came down from that side and looked out over the port and the water beyond it. And the light was doing something specific to the surface of the water, breaking into small, distinct pieces, the way light does when it is rested and unhurried. And, she thought, this is what I was building toward without knowing it, not the building. This. The standing here and being the one who made the foundation hold. There is a thing that gets said about people like Soo-ah, after the fact, in the particular retrospective tone that people use when they are acknowledging something they should have acknowledged in real time. They say, she was always the one holding it together. They say it as though it were obvious, as though it had always been visible, as though any observant person would have noticed. But the truth is that the people who hold things together are precisely the people who are easiest to overlook, because they are so skilled at making the holding appear effortless and ambient that everyone in the vicinity mistakes the effortlessness for the natural state of things, rather than for the result of sustained, disciplined, invisible work. The garage is where you put someone you have stopped seeing as the source. The table is where you put someone you know you depend on. The Yun family had put her in the garage because they had stopped seeing the source. Han Kyun-jin understood sources. He had spent 22 years understanding where power actually originated versus where it appeared to originate, and what happened when those two locations diverged too far from each other. He had watched more structures collapse from that divergence than from any other single cause. When he found Soo-ah in the garage in the rain, he was not doing her a favor. He was recognizing something true and responding to it accordingly, because he was the kind of man who, when he saw something true, moved toward it rather than away from it. The world he operated in rewarded the appearance of certainty, but he had learned, at cost, that it was accuracy that kept you alive. They were, by the spring, in the specific middle territory between a professional relationship and something else, a territory that neither of them was in a hurry to name, because naming it prematurely would have been a kind of structural error, putting the label on before the foundation was verified. They spent time in that territory with the patience of people who know that good load-bearing structures require time to cure, and that the curing is not a delay, it is the work. Minseo was the most accurate instrument of their progress. She was 9 and then 10, and she had her mother's gift for measuring things precisely, and she had begun to understand Han Kyung-gin as a person who arrived with documentation and stayed to answer questions, which was the highest compliment available in her internal taxonomy. She told her mother one evening in April that he was not like the other men from the family. Soo-ah asked her what she meant. Minseo thought about it for a moment with the seriousness she brought to precise questions and said, "He looks at you like he's listening to something you haven't said yet." Soo-ah was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "He does." Min Seo said, "Is that good?" Sua said, "It depends on what you haven't said." What Sua hadn't said, and what she was in the process of deciding whether she would say, was this: that she had built enough in her life for other people, and that what she was building now, the firm, the new address, the slow and careful territory with this man who read her work before he met her and came to a garage in the rain anyway, was for herself and her daughter, and that she was not willing to build it wrong. That the lesson of 11 years was not that she had been naive to invest in a family. The lesson was that investment without reciprocal attention is not relationship. It is subsidy. And she had been subsidizing the Yun family's belief in themselves for 11 years, and she was finished with subsidies. What she was interested in now was equity, not financial equity, though she had secured that. The other kind, the kind where two people have invested in the same thing in comparable measure and both show up, knowing it, and act accordingly. The kind where, if she sits in a garage, someone notices, and the noticing happens because the other person has been paying attention all along, not because the situation became dramatic enough to demand it. She said this to Kyung-jin on an evening in May, standing in the finished fourth-floor space of the Port District building, which was no longer open to the sky but framed now with glass that caught the harbor light and distributed it in long pale angles across the clean concrete floor. She said it plainly without softening it, because she was done with softening. She said, "I have built for other people. I know how to do that. I am very good at it. What I don't know yet is whether you are someone I can build with rather than for, and I am not interested in finding out unless you understand the difference." He was quiet for a moment. That was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of someone who takes a serious question seriously. Then he said, "I've been the one people build for my whole life. I'm aware of it. I don't know that I'm different yet. I know I want to be. I know the difference matters. I know that every structure I have ever trusted came from someone who was paying attention and was not being paid for it. And I know that the only thing I can offer you that has any value is the same thing: attention. Accurate, sustained, unglamorous attention. I can't promise you I won't fail at it. I can promise you I'll notice when I do." She listened to all of it. She said, "That's 11 words more than I expected." He said, "I counted before I spoke." Shh, because that was precisely the kind of person he was, the kind who counts before he speaks, who reads the reports before he arrives, who sits in a garage in the rain with a folding chair because the person sitting in it is worth sitting beside. She had spent 11 years surrounded by people who said important words without counting them, who made promises without auditing them, who arranged surfaces without checking foundations. She knew the difference between that and this. She had built her career on the difference. The building was certified occupancy ready in June. It was a Tuesday. Her team of 6 stood in the lobby, which had a floor of reclaimed stone and windows that ran from floor to ceiling on the harbor-facing wall, and the morning light came through those windows with the rested, unhurried quality she had come to associate with things that were built correctly, things that did not need to announce themselves because their solidity was self-evident to anyone who stood inside them. She signed the certification document in her firm's name, Park Soo-ah Structural Consultancy, her name first. 4 words. Kyung-jin was there. He stood to the side near the window while she signed. He did not stand in the center. He did not stand beside her for the photographs the team took afterward because she had not asked him to, and he understood that the photographs were hers and her team's, and he was not the subject. He was the person who had brought the problem to the person who could solve it, and the credit belonged entirely to the solver. And he knew this without being told, because he paid attention and he had read the reports before he arrived. This is the thing about attention. It is the foundation of every structure that holds. Not talent, not authority, not arrangement or performance or the management of appearances. Attention, the willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what you prefer to believe is there. The willingness to see the person in the garage as the source of the structure you are living inside. The willingness to count before you speak and read before you arrive and sit in the rain beside someone because they are worth sitting beside. Sua had paid that attention for 11 years to people who did not return it. She had not paid it, expecting return. She had paid it because it was who she was. But she had learned at cost that there is a difference between attention given freely and attention given without end to people who have decided they do not need to notice. The folding chair was where that distinction became undeniable. She kept the folding chair. She put it in the corner of her firm's office in the new space she leased in July, a floor above the Port District Building's lobby. It was the original chair, the one from the garage. She had carried it out that night when she left the reunion, not from sentiment but from accuracy. When new clients came to the office, they sat in proper chairs at a round table with windows that looked over the water. The folding chair in the corner was not displayed. It was simply there. Her team knew what it was. They had heard the story, or most of it, and they understood the chair, the way engineers understand a failed structural example, not as a monument to the failure, but as a reminder of the principle that the failure illustrated. The principle, the one she had learned in the garage in the rain, the one that ran through everything she built and everything she was building, was this: the person paying attention is the person holding the weight, and the person holding the weight deserves a seat at the table. Not the table as a performance of belonging, the table as an acknowledgement that the structure you are inside is standing because of them. She said this once at a conference in the autumn when she was asked to speak about structural integrity in a session that was intended to be about buildings. She spoke about buildings. She also spoke about this. The room of 300 engineers listened with the particular attention that a room gives to someone who is saying a true thing plainly. She did not look at Kyun Jin, who was in the back of the room, because she did not need to. She knew he was paying attention. He was always paying attention. That was who he was. She was building carefully and without rushing the specific knowledge of whether who he was would prove accurate over time, over the long curing time that good foundations require. She was not finished building, she had barely started, but the foundation was true. She could feel it the way she could always feel a true foundation, not with drama or certainty, but with the specific, quiet confidence of having done the work correctly and being willing to stand on it. 11 years earlier, she had walked into a family that looked like a foundation and was, in fact, a surface. She had spent those years discovering the difference from the inside. She had come out of the last reunion with a folding chair in the garage and the knowledge, clear and irreversible, of what she would and would not build for, and for whom and on what terms. The Yun family had given her that clarity without meaning to. The rain on the concrete floor, the closed door, the 12 minutes before a side door opened. She was grateful. In the specific and unsentimental way, she was grateful for structural failures. Because structural failures, when they are honest, tell you exactly where the actual load is, and who has been bearing it, and what the building was always actually standing on. The building was her, it had always been her, and now, finally, it was hers.